Hey guys! Tonight we begin with one of those names you've probably heard at least once, Ramses II. Or, if you want to sound extra historical at parties, Ramses the Great. Which, let's be honest, is a nickname he probably gave himself. Because what ruler ever said, just call me Ramses the Pretty Decent? Not this guy. So before we begin, let me ask you this, how's your day going so far? And we'd also love to know, where are you listening from tonight? It means a lot to us to feel connected with you, no matter where in the world you are. And if you've had a long or stressful day, here's what I want you to do. Put on your headphones, lie back on your bed, close your eyes, and just let yourself sink into our story. Let it carry the weight of the day away, so you can feel a little lighter, a little calmer, and a lot more free. Get comfy. Lights down, blanket up. Let's drift back about, 3,000 years or so. Back when the world was mostly desert, temples, and a whole lot of people pretending their kings were half divine. Ramses II wasn't just one of Egypt's pharaohs. He was the pharaoh people still think about when they picture pyramids, even though, tiny spoiler, pyramids were already old news by his time. But we'll let him keep the brand recognition. Ramses was born around 1303 BCE, and unlike your average kid in ancient Egypt who was probably more worried about surviving their toddler years, Ramses was born into the cushiest position possible. His father, Seti I, was pharaoh. Which meant little Ramses grew up in a world where the phrase, divine bloodline, wasn't just a metaphor, it was a family business model. Now, Seti I was one of those rulers who had to clean up messes left behind by earlier pharaohs. Egypt had gone through some political wobbles, and Seti was the guy patching holes in the empire like an overworked handyman. So, naturally, when his son Ramses came along, Seti decided to raise him like a mini version of himself. Think of it like when CEOs hand their toddler a fake briefcase, except Ramses got his own army. By the time he was a teenager, he was already parading around on military campaigns, because nothing says family bonding like putting your kid in charge of soldiers. And yes, he was technically too young for the job, but this is ancient Egypt we're talking about. Age was more of a suggestion. If your dad was pharaoh, you could basically skip the resume stage. So Ramses, still somewhere between acne and adulthood, was out there pretending to command troops while the real generals rolled their eyes and did the work. It's like letting your 12-year-old help drive by holding the steering wheel while you actually control the car. But here's the thing, Ramses stuck around. He lived a very long time by ancient standards, into his 90s. Which meant he got to grow into his role, unlike many of his contemporaries who died before they figured out which god was supposed to be their patron. By surviving, Ramses turned from that pampered prince with a chariot into that eternal old man who still won't give up the throne. Let's float over to his family life for a moment, because it's one of those dynastic soap operas where the cast list gets longer than a modern Netflix series. Ramses married early, probably in his early teens, again because Egypt did not waste time. His most famous wife was Nefertari, who was both his queen and, apparently, his favorite. And when I say favorite, I don't mean he only had one wife. Ramses had at least 8 great royal wives across his reign, plus a buffet of lesser wives and concubines. Because if you're pharaoh, why stop at one? It's like building monuments, quantity mattered as much as quality. And children. So many children. The numbers historians throw around vary, but it's safe to say Ramses fathered over 100 kids. Imagine family dinners. Or, more realistically, imagine not remembering half your children's names. Ramses probably just pointed at random toddlers like, yes, you, son number 47, off to priest school with you. Of course, when you have that many wives and children, inbreeding inevitably creeps in. Royal blood was treated like a luxury brand, you weren't supposed to dilute it with commoners. Which meant Ramses married some of his daughters. Yes. You heard that right. Pharaohs like to keep things in the family, literally. Before you recoil too hard, just remember, this wasn't a one-time Ramses thing. It was practically a dynastic tradition. Still creepy? Absolutely. But in their minds, it was divine lineage maintenance. Think of it like ancient Egypt's version of quality control. And if that's not enough family weirdness, Ramses also liked to immortalize his favorites in stone. You've probably seen the colossal statues of him sitting there, larger than life, carved into temples. The man had a flair for self-promotion that makes modern influencers look humble. He wasn't satisfied with one statue, he wanted dozens, maybe hundreds. Everywhere you turned in Egypt, there was Ramses' face staring back at you. And no, it wasn't subtle. Imagine walking into every town and seeing a 20-foot version of your boss's head carved into the local landmark. Ancient Egyptians must have been like, yes Ramses, we know, you're great. Can we get on with farming now? But let's slide back to his youth for a bit. Ramses was officially declared crown prince when he was around 14, which in that world was basically middle age. His father said I made sure he got hands-on experience with administration, military, and, of course, religious duties. That meant Ramses had to master the art of being half god, half politician, and occasionally, half mascot for the empire. Not a bad resume builder, though. By the time Seti died and Ramses took the throne in his early 20s, Egypt was in decent shape. And that gave Ramses the luxury of doing what he did best, making things bigger. Bigger temples. Bigger monuments. Bigger military campaigns. And, naturally, bigger family trees. He reigned for 66 years, which was long enough to outlive many of his own children. By the time Ramses died, some of his sons were already in their 60s, still waiting to inherit the throne. Imagine being a senior citizen still waiting for dad to retire. Talk about career stagnation. And since we're drifting slowly through his early reign, let's touch on the aesthetics. Ramses liked to present himself as both a warrior king and a godlike figure. Whether or not he was actually that great at war is another matter. But in temple inscriptions, he was basically invincible. One of his most famous victories was the Battle of Kadesh against the Hittites. And by victory, I mean, it was a stalemate. Both sides went home claiming they'd won. Ramses' version of the story: he single-handedly charged into battle, fought off thousands, and basically saved Egypt by being a superhero. The reality? He probably almost lost, and his army saved him. But when you control the scribes, history tends to get a flattering edit. Still, Ramses had a way of turning even mediocrity into legend. And that's what makes him fascinating. He wasn't necessarily the greatest general or the most innovative ruler. But he mastered the art of branding. Ramses II was the ancient world's king of self-promotion. He made sure that when you thought Egypt, you thought him. And in fairness, it worked. His name and monuments survived long after his actual empire declined. Now, since this is a sleepy story, let's take a softer detour. Picture young Ramses, still in training, walking through the vast temple complexes his father had restored. The sandstone glowing under the desert sun, priests muttering prayers to gods that seemed just as immortal as the monuments themselves. Ramses must have grown up with this sense of permanence, that his family was carved into the bones of Egypt itself. It's no wonder he believed his reign would stretch forever. Of course, forever is relative. Ramses lived to about 90, which, again, in ancient Egypt was practically impossible. Most people were gone before 30. Ramses outlived wives, children, generals, priests. He even outlived many of the enemies he had once fought. His reign became so long that he turned into a myth while still alive. And maybe that's why later generations remembered him as the Pharaoh. He was the one who just wouldn't go away. The eternal king, sitting there like one of his own statues, outlasting everyone else. And that's where we'll pause this part of the story. We've eased into Ramses' childhood, his family circus of wives and children, his early self-promotion campaigns, and his tendency to rewrite history in his favor. In the next stretch, we'll drift further into his reign, his endless building projects, his oh-so-epic not-quite victories, and his transformation into ancient Egypt's ultimate old man of power. But for now, just imagine those colossal statues staring out across the desert. Ramses' face, multiplied 100 times over, daring the sands of time to erase him. Spoiler, the sands kind of won, but only after thousands of years. So, when we left off, Ramses was strutting around in his early 20s, newly crowned pharaoh, and feeling pretty invincible. And why not? He had divine backing, dynastic stability, and a propaganda machine ready to paint him as the golden boy of Egypt. The only thing left to do was, well, everything. Ramses wasn't content to just rule quietly. Oh no. He was determined to make his reign bigger, louder, and shinier than anyone else's. Let's start with his building projects, because Ramses was essentially the ancient world's most enthusiastic contractor. The man did not know how to sit still. Instead of ruling from behind a desk, he decided to plaster his name, his statues, and his colossal ego all across Egypt. If there was a blank wall in a temple, Ramses carved his face into it. If there was a monument already standing, he didn't hesitate to chisel out the old name and replace it with his own. Recycling? Sure. Ancient Egypt had its own version of plagiarism, and Ramses was the undisputed champion. Take Karnak, the massive temple complex in Thebes. It was already a wonder of the world, filled with towering columns and endless courtyards. Ramses took one look at it and said, essentially, needs more me. He slapped on additions, inscriptions, statues, you name it. He also went to Luxor Temple and left his mark there, because clearly, no sacred space was complete without at least one Ramses endorsement deal. But the crown jewel of his building obsession was Abu Simbel. You've probably seen it, the temple carved directly into a cliff face, with 4 massive seated statues of Ramses staring out over the Nile. Each one about 66 feet tall. Subtle, right? Nothing says, humble servant of the gods, quite like a mountain-sized version of yourself. Imagine sailing down the river and suddenly seeing those faces looming at you. You'd get the message. Ramses was eternal, Ramses was divine, and Ramses had a lot of free time and stone carvers. Of course, these projects weren't just vanity. They were also propaganda. Every temple inscription, every relief, every carefully crafted narrative told the people the same story. Ramses was chosen by the gods, Ramses was victorious, Ramses was everything Egypt needed. Even when he wasn't. Which brings us to his military career. Ah yes, the famous Battle of Kadesh. Ramses' big moment of glory, or at least, his big attempt at glory. Around year 5 of his reign, he decided to flex his military muscles against the Hittites, a rival power-up in what's now modern-day Turkey and Syria. The Egyptians and Hittites had been fighting over this area like 2 kids fighting over the last cookie, and Ramses thought it was time to settle things once and for all. So, he gathered his army, divided into 4 divisions, and marched north. And then, things got messy. Very messy. At Kadesh, Ramses fell for what was essentially the oldest trick in the book, bad intel. Some Hittite spies pretended to be deserters and fed Ramses false information about enemy troop movements. Ramses believed them, because of course he did, and ended up leading part of his army straight into a Hittite ambush. Not ideal. What followed was chaos. Ramses found himself surrounded, his division cut off, and his carefully planned invasion unraveling faster than his sculptors could carve hieroglyphs. According to Ramses' version of events, though, none of this mattered. He claimed he personally leapt into his chariot, charged the enemy, and drove back thousands of Hittites with the sheer power of his heroic presence. Realistically, his army bailed him out, and he managed to escape a total disaster by the skin of his teeth. But did Ramses admit that? Of course not. Instead, he went back to Egypt and plastered every temple with the story of his glorious victory. Reliefs at Abu Simbel, Karnak, Luxor, all showing Ramses charging alone into battle, his horses rearing, his enemies scattering like ants. He even had entire walls dedicated to poems praising his courage. Essentially, Ramses invented the ancient art of spinning the narrative. CNN, Fox News, and every PR firm in the world could have taken lessons from him. And yet, for all the exaggeration, the battle wasn't a total loss. After years of posturing and minor clashes, Ramses eventually signed the world's first known peace treaty with the Hittites. The treaty basically said, you stay on your side, I'll stay on mine, and let's not waste more troops. Practical, if not exactly heroic. Still, Ramses presented it as another victory for himself. Naturally. Now, while all this was happening, Ramses' family life continued to expand at a frankly exhausting pace. His chief queen, Nefertari, was his favorite, and he built her a magnificent tomb in the Valley of the Queens. Her resting place, richly decorated and filled with scenes of her journey to the afterlife, is still one of the most stunning tombs from ancient Egypt. It shows that Ramses wasn't just about himself. Well, okay, he mostly was, but he did occasionally pour his energy into honoring the people closest to him. But of course, Nefertari wasn't the only queen. Ramses had others, like Isetnofret, who produced some of his most important heirs. And beyond the official queens, the royal harem was packed with wives, concubines, and offspring. His household must have resembled a chaotic school field trip at all times. Sons destined for priesthood, daughters married back into the family, everyone scrambling for a piece of royal favor. The sheer scale of Ramses' family created its own political machine. His sons commanded armies, his daughters held priestly roles, and his descendants spread across Egypt's bureaucracy. This sprawling dynasty reinforced Ramses' power in a way monuments alone never could. And, naturally, it meant even more opportunities for inbreeding. Because when your dating pool is limited to your siblings and cousins, things get complicated fast. Ancient Egypt's motto might as well have been, why look outside the palace when your sister is right here? But let's ease away from the chaos and return to the visual side of Ramses' reign. His building projects weren't just about size, they were about narrative. Every temple relief showed him larger than life, towering over enemies, receiving gifts from the gods, or smiting captives with casual godlike flair. The scale wasn't symbolic, it was literal. He was drawn bigger than everyone else. If you were a visiting dignitary and walked into one of his temples, you'd see Ramses as a giant, while you looked like a tiny figure kneeling at his feet. Subtle psychological warfare, carved in stone. It's also worth mentioning that Ramses had a thing for duplication. He didn't just build one colossus of himself, he built dozens. He didn't just inscribe one story of Kadesh, he inscribed it everywhere. If social media had existed, he'd have reposted the same picture of his heroic charge daily, with captions like #victory, #GodKing, #stillwinning. And the thing is, this relentless self-promotion worked. The Egyptians believed him. Later generations remembered him as Egypt's great warrior Pharaoh, the man who never lost a battle, the eternal king. Even though the reality was much less glamorous, Ramses understood the ancient golden rule, control the narrative, and you control history. Now, while all this makes Ramses sound like an egotistical workaholic, let's not forget he also reigned for over 60 years. That's a long time to stay relevant. His reign outlasted wars, famines, and even shifting alliances. He built so much that later pharaohs struggled to find space to add their own monuments. Ramses had basically filled up the architectural canvas of Egypt. Some of his successors even chipped away at his statues to reuse the stone, because, frankly, there was just too much Ramses everywhere. And here's a sleepy little detail for you. By the time Ramses was in his 80s, his kingdom must have felt like it had always been under his rule. Generations grew up knowing no other pharaoh. Imagine being born, living your whole life, and dying, all under the reign of the same ruler. To many Egyptians, Ramses wasn't just a king. He was time itself. Eternal. The desert sun might rise and set, but Ramses would always be there, seated on his throne, a living monument. Of course, old age eventually caught up with him. By the later years of his reign, Ramses had lost teeth, suffered arthritis, and probably hobbled around like a creaky old man. But he didn't slow down. He still appeared in public ceremonies, still commissioned building projects, still demanded recognition as Egypt's eternal monarch. His sons kept waiting for him to die, probably nervously rehearsing their coronation speeches, only for Ramses to stubbornly outlive them. Out of over 100 children, he buried many before himself. Pharaoh of longevity, indeed. And that's where we'll gently pause part 2. We've drifted through Ramses' monumental ego, his questionable victories, his peace treaties, his wives and dynastic chaos, and his transformation into Egypt's permanent background wallpaper. Next, we'll move into his twilight years, the old man pharaoh who refused to fade, his final legacy, and the bizarre afterlife of his mummy. For now, picture Abu Simbel again, those 4 colossal statues staring down at the Nile. Ramses' eternal gaze, fixed in stone, watching as centuries drifted by. That was his plan all along, to be too big to forget. And, judging by the fact we're still talking about him 3,000 years later, well, he kind of nailed it. So, here we are, drifting into the later years of Ramses' life. By this point, he had been pharaoh for decades. Entire generations of Egyptians had been born, lived their lives, and died, all under his reign. Imagine being a farmer in Thebes. Your father plowed the same fields under Ramses, you plowed them under Ramses, and your children would still be plowing them under Ramses. For many Egyptians, he wasn't just a ruler anymore. He was the air, the sky, the unchanging constant of life. Of course, constant doesn't mean youthful. By his 70s, Ramses was an old man. By his 80s, he was practically a living fossil. And by his 90s, he must have looked like he'd been embalmed while still alive. But here's the thing, he kept going. Arthritis bent his body, his teeth were gone, his hair turned white, and yet, he still presented himself as the eternal warrior king. You've got to admire the commitment. Let's linger a bit on the family situation at this point, because it's both tragic and absurd. Ramses had over 100 children. Which means, statistically, he buried a lot of them. His firstborn son, Ammonius Hatshepsut, was meant to inherit the throne. But Ramses outlived him. And his second son. And his third. He went through heirs like most people go through sandals. By the time he finally died, his 13th son, Merneptah, was the one left standing to take over. Imagine waiting for your father to retire, for 66 years. Poor Merneptah was already in his 60s when he became pharaoh. He spent his whole life in the shadow of a dad who just wouldn't quit. That's not inheritance, that's a curse. But Ramses' longevity wasn't just hard on his kids. It shaped Egypt's politics. With the same ruler in place for so long, the entire bureaucracy calcified around him. Priests, generals, officials, all of them lived in the world of Ramses. It meant stability, sure, but also stagnation. When you've got the same old pharaoh for decades, innovation tends to slow down. Egypt looked powerful, but cracks were starting to show beneath the surface. And yet, Ramses didn't stop building. Even in old age, he continued to commission temples and monuments. His workers must have groaned every time he announced another colossal project. Another statue. Really? Don't we already have 30 of you at Karnak? But Ramses believed in legacy through stone. The more his name and face were carved, the harder it would be for time to erase him. He wasn't wrong. One of the quieter tragedies of his later life was the loss of Nefertari, his beloved queen. Her grand tomb in the Valley of the Queens had already been completed, decorated with breathtaking paintings of her joining the gods. When she died, Ramses honored her as no queen before had been honored. But after her, his later queens never quite filled the same space in his heart, or in history. Nefertari remained the great love story of his reign, her image preserved alongside his, even as countless other wives faded into the background. So, by the end, Ramses was less a man than a monument in motion. He had become Egypt's eternal mascot. When he finally died, sometime around 1213 BCE, he was about 90 years old. Which, again, in a world where the average lifespan was about 30, made him practically immortal. Egyptians must have been shocked. Wait, the pharaoh can die. We thought he'd just keep going forever. And so began the second act of his story, the afterlife. Ramses was buried in the Valley of the Kings, like many pharaohs before him. His tomb, KV7, was massive but poorly preserved compared to some others. Floods and looters damaged it over time, leaving it in rough shape today. But what mattered more than the tomb itself was the mummy. Because Ramses' body would go on to have a whole new career thousands of years later. See, here's the thing, ancient Egyptians believed the body had to be preserved for the soul to live on. Ramses' embalmers did their best, but centuries took their toll. His mummy was moved multiple times, hidden away by priests during later dynasties to protect it from tomb robbers. Eventually, it ended up in a royal cache, along with other great pharaohs, discovered in the 19th century. And that's when Ramses II made his modern comeback. In 1881, his mummy was unwrapped, and for the first time in over 3,000 years, people looked upon the face of Ramses the Great. And here's the delightful irony. The most handsome, most godlike pharaoh turned out to look like, well, an old man. Which, to be fair, he was when he died. His nose was hooked, his jaw narrow, his body thin and frail. Not exactly the superhero from those battle reliefs. The man who had himself carved 30 feet tall in perfect youthful vigor was, in reality, a withered skeleton of his former self. History, once again, had the last laugh. But Ramses' afterlife wasn't done yet. In the 1970s, his mummy began to deteriorate, and Egypt made the unusual decision to send him abroad for restoration. That's right, Ramses II was issued a modern passport. Occupation listed. King, deceased. Imagine being the customs officer who had to stamp that. Ramses was flown to Paris, given full honors, and treated like the royalty he had once been. Even 3,000 years later, he got more respect than most living politicians. French scientists worked to preserve him, studying his remains and confirming what we already suspected, that he suffered from arthritis, dental issues, and probably arteriosclerosis in his old age. Essentially, he was a 90-year-old man with all the health problems you'd expect. But still, it was surreal. Ramses II, Pharaoh of Egypt, lying under fluorescent lab lights in Paris, being poked and prodded by modern doctors. Eventually, he was returned to Egypt, reburied in Cairo's museum, and continues to rest in the National Museum of Egyptian Civilization today. Tourists line up to see him, peering at the withered face of the man who once ruled the known world. And somewhere, I like to imagine Ramses chuckling. After all his efforts to immortalize himself, here he is, 3,000 years later, still drawing crowds. Mission accomplished. Now, let's ease back and reflect for a moment. Ramses II wasn't necessarily the greatest general. He wasn't the most innovative ruler. And he definitely wasn't the most modest. But he mastered something that mattered just as much, legacy. Through stone, story, and sheer stubbornness, he made sure his name would echo for millennia. He understood that history isn't just what you do. It's what people say you did. And Ramses controlled that narrative with the precision of a modern PR agency. The Battle of Kadesh. He spun it into victory. His endless statues. A campaign of branding. His temples. Billboards of divine authority. He left so much of himself behind that later generations couldn't forget him even if they wanted to. And that's why, today, he's still Ramses the Great. Not because he was flawless, but because he was relentless. He refused to be small, refused to fade, refused to leave the stage quietly. Even in death, he traveled the world, became an exhibit, and continued to be remembered. Few rulers can claim that kind of endurance. So, as you drift off tonight, picture that eternal image, Ramses seated on his throne, colossal and unmoving, watching the Nile flow past. The desert winds rise, the centuries turn, empires fall, but there he sits. Patient. Eternal. Waiting. The Pharaoh who outlasted time.